Looking at the map right now, we've got a pretty interesting setup across the United States. What makes this different from a typical single system day is that we're not dealing with just one storm or one frontal boundary. Instead, we're seeing multiple weather systems active at the same time, and each one is affecting a different part of the country. So let's break this down step by step and talk about what's happening in each region. First, let's start with the big picture. When we look at the overall synoptic pattern, what we're seeing is basically a divided country. The West Coast has its own system coming in off the Pacific Ocean. The northern states and the Great Lakes region are locked into cold air, which is setting up snow potential. Over on the East Coast, there's a separate cyclonic system spinning out over the Atlantic Ocean. And in between all of this, the central United States is sitting in a relatively quiet zone. So this isn't one massive storm sweeping coast to coast. It's multiple areas of activity, each doing their own thing. Now, before we dive into the regional details, we need to talk about temperature, because temperature is what determines whether precipitation falls as rain or snow. And right now, the temperature gradient across the country is pretty sharp. Up in the northern states and around the Great Lakes, temperatures are at or below freezing. We're talking about 0 Celsius and lower in many areas. As you move south, temperatures gradually warm up, and by the time you get down to the Gulf Coast and the southern states, it's well above freezing. The transition zone, where temperatures hover right around the freezing mark, is somewhere across the central states. And that transition zone is important because that's where precipitation type can change quickly. You could see snow in one spot, sleet just a bit further south, and rain even further down. So keep that temperature structure in mind as we go through each region. Let's start in the west, along the Pacific coast. Right now, there's a frontal system moving in off the ocean, and it's bringing moisture with it. This is pretty typical for this time of year. When these Pacific systems come on shore, they bring steady rain to the coastal areas. Places like Washington, Oregon, and Northern California are seeing that rain right now. It's not explosive or severe, but it's persistent. And as that moisture moves inland and encounters the mountains, things change. The air is forced upward, it cools, and the rain transitions to snow. So if you're in the Cascades, the Sierra Nevada, or the Northern Rockies, you're dealing with snow. This is what we call orographic snowfall. The mountains basically wring the moisture out of the air, and it falls as snow at higher elevations. Down in the valleys, it's rain. Up in the mountains, it's snow. That pattern is going to continue as this system pushes further inland over the next 12 to 24 hours. Now let's move to the northern states and the Great Lakes region. This is where cold air is really in control. Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and parts of the Dakotas are all sitting under a cold air mass, and temperatures are well below freezing. When you have cold air like this, any precipitation that develops is going to fall as snow. And in the Great Lakes region specifically, there's an added factor. We've got what's called lake effect snow potential. When cold air moves over the relatively warmer waters of the Great Lakes, it picks up moisture, and that moisture gets dumped as snow on the downwind side of the lakes. So areas on the eastern and southern shores of the Great Lakes, places like western Michigan, northern Indiana, and western New York, these are spots where snow can really add up. It's not always a massive, widespread storm. Sometimes it's narrow bands of heavy snow, and if you're in one of those bands, you can see several inches pile up in just a few hours. If you're just outside the band, you might see nothing. That's the nature of lake effect snow. It's localized, but it can be intense. The Rockies and the higher elevations in the interior west are also seeing snow. This goes hand in hand with what we talked about on the Pacific coast. As systems move inland from the ocean and hit the mountains, snow develops. Colorado, Wyoming, Montana. These states are all seeing some level of snowfall, especially at higher elevations. If you're planning to travel through mountain passes, be aware that conditions can deteriorate quickly. Snow and wind in the mountains can create low visibility and slick roads, so just keep that in mind. Now let's talk about the East Coast and the Atlantic. This is where things get a little different. Out over the Atlantic Ocean, there's a separate low-pressure system, and it's showing a pretty classic cyclonic structure. You can see it on the satellite as a spiral of clouds rotating around a center. The bulk of the precipitation associated with this system is actually out over the ocean. It's not directly on shore right now, but depending on how this system tracks over the next day or so, it could bring rain to the coastal areas. Places like the mid-Atlantic coast, maybe parts of New England, could see some rain if this system edges closer to land. The key here is the track. If it stays offshore, most of the impacts stay offshore. If it nudges westward, the coastal areas will feel it more. Right now, it looks like the heaviest precipitation is staying out over the water, so coastal impacts are moderate, but it's something to watch. What about the central United States? Here's where things are actually pretty quiet. The Central Plains, parts of the Midwest, these areas are sitting in between all the active zones we just talked about. There's no major frontal system moving through, no big moisture surge, no significant temperature battles. It's just relatively calm. That doesn't mean the weather is perfect everywhere, but compared to what's happening on the coasts and up north, the center of the country is in a quieter pattern right now. That can change, of course, as systems move and evolve, but for the moment, if you're in Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma, or that general area, you're not dealing with any major weather headlines. Now, let's talk about where the moisture is coming from, because that's an important part of understanding these systems. On the west coast, the moisture source is obvious. It's the Pacific Ocean. Those frontal systems are basically atmospheric rivers pulling moisture off the ocean and dumping it on the coast and mountains. On the east coast, the Atlantic is providing moisture for that offshore system, and down in the south, the Gulf of Mexico is playing a role in keeping temperatures mild, but it's not driving a major moisture surge into the interior right now. The Gulf is more of a background player in this setup, keeping the southern tier warm and humid, but not feeding a big active storm system. The main moisture action is happening on the coasts, not in the interior. The satellite imagery backs all of this up. On the satellite, you can see a long, dense band of clouds along the west coast. That's the frontal system we talked about. Over the Great Lakes and the northern states, there's a broad area of cloud cover. That's consistent with the cold air and snow potential. Out over the Atlantic, you can see that spiral structure, which confirms the cyclonic system. And over the central United States, the clouds are more scattered and fragmented. There's no big, organized system there. So the satellite is telling us the same story the other maps are telling us. Multiple systems, different regions, different impacts. Let's talk about precipitation accumulation. When we look at the 12-hour accumulation map, here's what stands out. The heaviest totals are along the Pacific coast. That makes sense. That frontal system is bringing steady, persistent rain and mountain snow. And it's been doing that for a while. Accumulation totals, there are going to be significant, especially in the mountains where snow is piling up. In the Great Lakes region and the northern states, there's also accumulation showing up. But remember, a lot of that is snow. When we talk about precipitation accumulation, we're usually talking about liquid equivalent. So an inch of rain equals roughly 10 inches of snow, depending on the snow's density. So if you see moderate accumulation on the map in the northern areas, that could translate to several inches of snow on the ground. Over the Atlantic, there's a large area of accumulation, but again, most of that is over the ocean. It's not impacting land directly. And in the central United States, accumulation is pretty light. There's not much going on there in terms of widespread organized precipitation. So if you're trying to figure out where the most active weather is, it's the west coast and the northern tier. Those are your hotspots right now. So what does all of this mean for you? Well, it depends on where you are. If you're on the west coast, especially in the Pacific Northwest, expect rain to continue. It's not severe, but it's steady. If you're in the mountains, you're dealing with snow, and that snow is going to keep falling. If you're traveling through mountain passes, give yourself extra time and be prepared for winter driving conditions. If you're in the northern states or around the Great Lakes, you're in the cold sector, and snow is the main story. Lake effect snow can be intense in localized areas, so if you're in one of those typical lake effect zones, keep an eye on radar and be ready for conditions to change quickly. A few inches of snow can fall in a short period of time when those bands set up. If you're on the East Coast, particularly along the Mid-Atlantic or New England coast, watch that offshore system. Right now, it's staying mostly over the ocean, but if it shifts westward, you could see rain developing along the coast. It's not a major threat at the moment, but it's worth monitoring. And if you're in the central United States, enjoy the break. You're in the calm zone right now. No major systems are affecting you, and that's not a bad place to be when the rest of the country is dealing with active weather. One more thing to keep in mind, that 0 degrees Celsius line, the freezing line, is the boundary between rain and snow. In areas where temperatures are hovering right around freezing, precipitation type can change hour by hour. You might start with rain, transition to sleet, and then end up with snow, all within a few hours. That's especially true in the transition zones we talked about earlier. So if you're in one of those areas, don't assume the precipitation type is going to stay the same all day. Check updates frequently. The big takeaway here is that the United States is dealing with multiple systems right now, not just one. The West has its Pacific system. The North has cold air and snow. The East has an offshore cyclone. And the center is relatively quiet. Each region is experiencing its own weather story, and those stories are all unfolding at the same time. It's not one massive coast-to-coast storm. It's a collection of regional events and understanding that helps you know what to expect in your specific area. Stay aware, check updates, and be ready for conditions that match your region's pattern.